On June 17th, inside the European Parliament in Strasbourg, elected representatives chanted, "Send them back." They were celebrating. The EU has just passed its toughest migration legislation in decades. 418 votes in favor, 218 against. Rejected asylum seekers can now be sent to detention centers outside the bloc, held up for 2 years, families with children included. The right to automatically appeal suspended. Home invasions modeling ICE from the USA. The same evening, I had a conversation with a man I'm still trying to make sense of. I said, "What a shameful time in history." And then it unraveled. I have been sitting with that conversation ever since, and with a question I genuinely cannot answer, which is the question this episode is about. How do we come closer? Not agree. I'm not asking for agreement. I'm asking something smaller and harder. How do we find our way back into the same room? How do we stop looking at each other across a distance that feels more and more like it has been deliberately built to keep us there? How do we maintain our respect for human rights and dignity and engage in political conversation? I keep returning to all of this, and I keep hitting the same wall, my own exhaustion. I will come back to that, but first, I want to talk about what we are actually dealing with, because I think we have been misdiagnosing the problem, and that misdiagnosis is costing us. You're listening to The Social Mosaic. I am Anna, writer, social work student, and your host. This is where I think out loud about power, inequality, and the structures that shape how we live. Let's get into it. We need to make a distinction that almost never gets made when people talk about how divided we are. There is a kind of disagreement that is healthy, necessary even. Two people, two positions, genuinely held, arrived at through different experiences, different reading, different lives. That kind of disagreement is the engine of political change. It pushes things forward. It asks questions that wouldn't otherwise get asked. I do not want to get rid of that. I don't think it's a problem. What I'm worried about is something else entirely. What we're living through now is not a natural divergence of views. It's a system, a deliberately constructed infrastructure of division, and it is working exactly as designed. Here is how it works. You open your phone, the algorithm, which has been studying you for years, serves you the content calibrated to keep you scrolling, not content that informs or challenges, content that provokes outrage, fear, rage, because fear keeps you on the platform longer than curiosity does. The platform doesn't care what you believe, it cares how long you stay. Then there is the AI chat box, the digital sycophant that validates everything you say, that makes you feel like the most informed, most intelligent, most correct person in the room. Nobody reads the warning that the chatbot can make mistakes. It feels too good to be told you are right. So people follow it blindly. The line between researched opinion and the algorithmically generated confirmation disappears. And then there are people investing, seriously, strategically investing, in making sure certain ideas dominate. This is not a conspiracy theory. The BBC confirmed that Elon Musk hosted a 74-minute live conversation with the leader of Germany's far right Alternative for Deutschland party on his platform X, calling the AfD Germany's only hope. A France 24 investigation analyzes more than 15,000 of his posts over 5 months and found he was systemically boosting far right voices across Europe. But Musk is one name. Get rid of him tomorrow and someone else steps in. Because the infrastructure he is plugged into, the funding networks, the platform architectures, the media ecosystems, those predate him and will outlast him. According to Oxfam 2026 report, billionaires are now estimated to be 4,000 times more likely to hold political office than ordinary citizens. Almost half of people surveyed across 66 countries say the rich buy elections. This is Oxfam. This is documented. And what does all of this produce? People who are isolated, terrified, enraged, and lonely. The perfect condition for manipulation. A frightened, isolated person is easy to hand the scapegoat. And the scapegoat is always the same. It is the migrant taking your job. It is the feminists destroying the family. It is Islam that comes to replace European civilization. So much propaganda. And at the end of it, you see people isolated, enraged, lonely, pointing at each other while the people building the system count their money. Let me be specific for a moment about something that gets deliberately obscured. When European politicians talk about migration crisis, when they build election campaigns around immigration, when the far right wins in the Netherlands, in Austria, in Italy, in Germany, they are not talking about white European migrants. They are not talking about American expats, Australian professionals, Greek students. The debate is almost entirely targeted at Muslim, Arab, and Black people. I have been a migrant. I experienced moments of discrimination in the Netherlands, moments when I wasn't speaking the language, when I didn't look European enough, when I felt the edge of that hostility. But my experience is not what this debate is about. I have also worked as a volunteer with people arriving by sea, with asylum seekers in the Netherlands. I have sat across from people who crossed the Mediterranean in rubber dinghies, who walked across borders in winter, who lost people along the way. And I have heard them being described on the evening news as a threat, as an invasion, as a crisis to be managed rather than human beings to be received. It is a story so old it gets tiring, and it is, at its core, a lie. Here is one number that never makes the front page. According to Eurostat's 2025 official EU statistics, 43.8 of non-European citizens living in the EU face the risk of poverty or social exclusion. The people being scapegoated for Europe's problems are themselves amongst its most economically precarious residents. Meanwhile, according to Oxfam, EU governments are losing 286.5 billion euros every year. That is roughly 33 million euros every hour because they refuse to fairly tax the wealthiest people in Europe. That is the financial hemorrhage nobody is chanting about in the European Parliament. Why migration and not that? Because migration gives you a face to point at. Wealth inequality asks you to look up, and the people at the top would rather we keep looking sideways. There is a particular move within this landscape that I need to name because it deserves its own analysis. It is the use of women's rights and women's safety to justify anti immigration policies. We hear it constantly. Immigrants, and the word is always illegal or alien, never undocumented, as if the language doesn't carry weight. Immigrants are coming to assault our women. They are a threat to European women's safety and dignity, and so protecting Europe means keeping them out. I heard this argument this week. This man sitting across from two women telling us who we should be afraid of at night. Sociologist Sarah Faris at Goldsmith University of London has a name for this political movement. She calls it femonationalism, the co-optation of feminist language and women's rights by nationalist and far-right movements to advance anti-immigration agendas. Her 2017 book, published by Duke University Press, traces this specifically in France, Italy, and the Netherlands. It is not new. It has been building for decades. And here is what makes it a betrayal rather than just a lie. And I want to go to the data because this is a conversation with data matters and I want to be precise. Gender-based EU gender-based violence survey coordinated with the European Institute for Gender Equality and the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights is the most comprehensive official dataset on this subject that we have. And here's what it shows. 18% of women across the EU have experienced physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner over the course of their lives. 32% have experienced psychological violence by a partner, And crucially, in the vast majority of EU member states, strangers account for less than half of the perpetrators of violence against women. The European Parliament itself, summarizing this data, notes that because of the close ties between victim and perpetrator, it can be difficult for victims to disclose their experience or report incidents to the police. This is not an opinion. This is the European Union's own statistics. The threat to women is overwhelmingly coming from people known to them: partners, relatives, someone trusted enough to get close, someone already inside the house. So when a man tells you that the danger is the person arriving by boat, while Eurostat tells you clearly that the danger is statistically far more likely to be someone sleeping in your own bed, you have to ask whose interest that narrative actually serves. I will tell you who it does not serve: women's. The same politicians invoking women's safety to justify deportations are, in many cases, the same ones voting against reproductive rights, cutting funding for domestic violence services, opposing gender equality legislation. It is not protection. It is a facade. It is one of the most cynical facades I have encountered in political life because it uses the real suffering of women as a prop for an agenda that has nothing to do with women's well being. There is a political philosopher I want to bring in here because her framework helps name something important. And then I want to push back a little bit. Iron Young, in her 2011 book Responsibility for Justice, argues that we are all structurally connected, that living in the same society, participating in the same economy, using the same institutions means we share political responsibility for the outcomes those structures produce, even when we didn't personally design them, even when we didn't consciously choose them. The wealthy European whose tax avoidance drains public services, the voter who elects the politician who gets asylum funding, the person who scrolls past the news without pausing. All of us, Young argues, are implicated in the conditions other peoples live under. I find this framework important, largely correct. The idea that we are all structurally entangled, that my relative's safety and another person's precarity exist within the same system, is a basis for solidarity rather than indifference. But then I think of that conversation. This man was white, middle aged, and certain. He had statistics which he could not show them, but he had them. He was talking about Muslim people, Middle Eastern people, African people. He used the word savages. He used the word uncivilized. I've been sitting with these words since the end of that conversation. These are not new words. They are the exact vocabulary that European colonial administration used to justify the theft of land, the enslavement of people, the dismantling of entire civilizations. Savage, uncivilized. A white man in 2026 reaching into that vocabulary as if it were neutral description, as if those words carry no history. His central argument was that these people, and it was always these people, a group so enormous and diverse it defies any coherent description, collapses into a single threatening mass. These people come to Europe to rape, kill, and steal. I tried. I named the Eurostat data on gender based violence, the EU own statistics showing that in the vast majority of member states, the perpetrators of violence against women are not strangers. They are partners, family members, people trusted enough to get close. He was not interested. I explained that the claim about immigrants being responsible for the majority of this crime does not exist in any official data set anywhere in Europe because the data simply does not say that. And in many countries, the breakdown by migration status is not even recorded in that way, making precise claims impossible to verify and easy to fabricate. He was not interested. I try to explain how cognitive bias works, how propaganda functions, how assigning collective guilt to millions of people based on religion, race, or region of origin is exactly the logic that has justified every atrocity in modern history. He was not interested. At some point, I asked him directly, are we having a conversation or are you looking for a I got you moment? He wanted the I got you moment. And then, sitting in front of two women, he said, white men would never do that to you. Me and my sisters know which men to run from at night. We have known since we were girls. But my personal lived experience, the experience of a woman who has actually walked those streets, who has actually felt that fear, was not data he was willing to receive. It did not serve his narrative, so it did not exist. So, this is where Iris Myron Young's theory becomes complicated because what her framework asks of us in practice is that someone takes the first step toward connection. Someone extends themselves. Someone sits down with the person who has been taught to see them as a problem and begins patiently to explain. And that someone is almost always expected to be the person who has already paid the highest price. It is always migrants who are expected to integrate, to prove themselves deserving of belonging. It is always women who are expected to be patient with the men who have not done the reading. It is always the oppressed who are assigned the work of educating the oppressor. Why should I be the one to educate you? Why can you not be the one to step back and try to understand my point of view? I have been asked my whole life to make myself easier to receive, to modulate my anger, to explain myself in ways that are comfortable for people who have never had to explain themselves at all. And I carry that tiredness, not just mine, the tiredness of the women before me who had these same conversations with different faces, who explained the same things and were ignored, who built bridges that got torn down and started building them again. Sometimes the only honest thing I can say is enough. But I want to say one more thing about that man because I think it matters. He may not be the one to attack anyone, not to kill a woman or assault an immigrant in the streets. But his way of thinking is the poison that moves through our society. It normalizes the chants inside the European Parliament. It makes detention hubs feel like common sense. It makes the vote of the 418 feel inevitable. You do not have to commit violence to enable it. You just have to keep saying these people until it stops feeling like anything at all. I told you at the start of this episode, I keep hitting my own exhaustion when I try to answer the questions of how we come closer. That is true. And I do not have a clean answer. I want to be honest about that rather than giving you a resolution that material doesn't support. But I don't want to leave you in rage either. Not because rage is wrong. Rage is often the correct response to injustice, and I felt it acutely this week, but because misdirected rage is one of the things the system harvests. It is what keeps us looking sideways at each other instead of up. So let me offer what I actually have, which is not a solution, but a reorientation. The digital divide that accelerates all others has a simple corrective that no algorithm can manufacture: actually talking to each other. Not online, in person, in real space, in the friction of genuine encounter. I have been caught in my own echo chamber too. I have curated my feed carefully and the platform feeds it back to me. What has broken it every time is a conversation with someone outside it. You realize very quickly that not everyone has been exposed to what you have been exposed to, that the world as it appears on someone else's screen looks completely different. And in that moment of recognition, something shifts. Not agreement, just the beginning of contact. We have also seen social media be used to connect people, to make visible what people wanted keep hidden, to amplify movements that change things. That capacity is real, but we should never mistake the platform for a public square. It is a company. It exists to make profit from our attention. When the person running the platform is actively amplifying fascism, the tool is no longer neutral. I also want to say this to anyone listening who has more structural safety than someone else: more citizenship, more whiteness, more class security, more institutional access. The labor of bridge building is not theirs, it is yours. Do not wait to be invited to the conversation. Do not wait to be educated. Pick up that book. Come to the table having done the work. That is not a small thing. That is actually the thing. And if you're someone who is tired, the way I am tired, the way that women before me were tired, I want you to know that your exhaustion is not weakness. It is a rational response to an irrational demand. You do not owe anyone your endless patience. You are allowed to take rest. The question of how we come closer does not have a clean answer, but I know some things that are true. The distance was built, it was funded, it was designed, and anything that was built can be dismantled slowly, imperfectly, in community, by people who refuse to believe that the person across from them is their enemy when the evidence suggests their shared enemies are somewhere else entirely. I do not know if that is enough. Some days it does not feel like it. But humanity is still in us. I have seen it. I have seen it in the faces of people who have lost everything and still made room for someone else. In the conversations that happen when people stop performing for an algorithm and just speak. In the fact that you are here listening, which means something in you is still reaching. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, where everything begins. Thank you.